Welcome to another PL Together Lounge Talk. I'm Adam Geller, founder and CEO of Edthena, the video reflection platform for teachers to improve their classroom practice. Today, we're talking with Zaretta Hammond about culturally responsive teaching. She's the author of Culturally Responsive Teaching and the Brain, and she's also a huge fan of the Marvel Universe. And I think that this is fitting because when I think about the Marvel Universe, I think it's an image of a better version of the future, right? So let's talk about a better version of the future and the optimism that I hope we can all take on as we look ahead. Obviously, the pandemic has been a lot, but we've got an opportunity here. We're all going back to classrooms this year. We're hoping that it's going to be full time for the whole year, right? So we have an opportunity to rethink what our schools look like, what our classrooms look like. That's a really big prompt. So maybe let me dial it in a little bit. Help me if I'm a school leader. What is one small thing that I could be like really committing to that would meaningfully change how my school is leading students to their full potential?
Yeah, I think that is a great question, right? That the pandemic was a lot, but there is a gift in the disruption because the disruption of schooling as usual has brought us to new places. We now know what's possible. So we have to think about what do we keep? What do we stop? Because we realize, oh, we didn't need to be doing that before we start doing new things. So being able to move out of this past year into a new year, a lot of people are talking about reimagining. So reimagining starts with understanding all these wonderful things we can reimagine and we want to change. But change comes one domino at a time, if you will, using the analogy of, dominoes set up one behind the other in elaborate patterns. You still have to push the lead domino. So you have to think about what's the small but high leverage change that you can make that becomes a positive, disruptive innovation that can move through your system. So I think the balance of asynchronous and synchronous learning is one of the things we can move into our regular life. As a leader, I think one of the things we definitely want to be able to do is to say, how do we give more autonomy to students for their own learning? How do we create the school system that moves away from compliance and pedagogy that gets students just kind of back into kind of the regular way they're doing things? Because here's the thing, there is lots of conversation about this idea of learning loss. And how we respond to that is going to be based on our reimagining and understanding the science of what's high leverage is going to be really, really important. Otherwise, what we're going to do is just double down on what wasn't working before because we think kids are behind. So we're going to have the social emotional space, and this is where leaders come in. What's the thing that you can do is to not fall back into that, we're just going to keep doing the same things, but to actually create space for teachers to innovate, for students to be co-creators, for parents to be in relationship in new ways. I really think that is one of the best things that's going to come out of the pandemic in terms of schooling, leadership, sharing ways that we had to partner with parents. We shouldn't just abandon that. So I think that's one thing. I think similarly, when we think about what happens in the classroom, right? Being able to give students more autonomy around their own learning in ways that are intellectually engaging and stimulate intellectual curiosity. There were some teachers that were really doing that. There were some folks out there that were creating packets and sending it home, and then kids would kind of meet up on Zoom to compare how they were doing, but from their own science projects or whatever. This hands-on learning by doing is a core collectivist practice, right? So the idea that you are thinking and talking and doing is what a lot of students experience. there's a whole segment of students that thrived outside of normal school. Why did they thrive? Because now they can lean into how they learned best and that they had the supports to do that. So, looking at ways where we can bring the best of that, support it so that all students can access that. Um, so teachers are only dealing with the right number of things, right? These are the small, high leverage things that we should be doing. Um, I also think feedback. John Hattie and his visible learning effect size list feedback is one of the number one things we could be doing, beginning in first, second, third grade, helping students understand what it means to get feedback, not just good job, but to actually say, hey, here's what you're doing well, here's what you need to improve, here are the steps out there that you can go because we've covered this before. So to me, this is one of those elements that, given the new space we have in classrooms, we should be bringing feedback in in a much bigger way, autonomy in a much bigger way, right? A different type of adult learning community and adult culture in schools that has social emotional self-care at the core is, some of it's an important element that I think leaders should be thinking about. So we all have our high leverage, small high leverage thing that we could be doing, but they all sync up, right? They all create a type of synergy.
One thing that I was thinking about it, as you're responding to my question, for to help us find that example of the one small thing, actually, what started to become really clear for me by that was, in some ways, the definitions of the things to stop doing. So maybe it wasn't necessarily the answer of what the right thing is for our one school or our one classroom, but like when you were talking about the autonomy and making sure we don't remove that from the student experience, what I immediately thought of was, well, that probably means things like don't program in the double dose remediation math class, assuming that all students are going to need, 2 years of math instruction next year instead of just one. It was kind of thinking like those practices that we were so used to doing, those are the things we might actually be able to rethink, and that in some ways could be holding us back from finding these newer as we're talking about, smaller, high leverage ways to change what's happening in a school and a classroom.
Absolutely. And this is where the knowledge of culturally responsive instruction to accelerate comes in. So again, if we're not doing a double dose of remediation, a lot of people say, well, what will we be doing? Well, we are actually going to be teaching students how to learn new content so they can accelerate for themselves. So it may be 15 to 20 minutes 2 or 3 times a week that they're really focusing on getting students to engage in the kind of productive struggle that allows them to actually learn new content quicker, or to learn a particular approach, or to give feedback, conferencing with students. We did more of that on the Zoom than I think we did in our classrooms in person. So being able to, you're absolutely right to think about not only what are we saying yes to, but what do we have to say no to in order to make that yes possible?
Tell us more about this idea of focusing on making sure students are learning how to learn. Maybe obviously that's the goal here, but is there maybe a small, high leverage thing we can give to students or talk about with students that they can think of as the small, high leverage change they're making for themselves?
I think there are two things we can do. We can't give anything. We can be no more than the personal trainer. You want to get well or healthy or lose weight. The trainer doesn't give you anything. What the trainer does is understands your goals and your level of motivation, puts a program together and coaches you through that when you're in the hour you're with them. And then they give you the tools that you can go home and continue to make lifestyle changes. So part of what we're trying to do as personal trainers of students' cognition is show them, give them tools, coach them to use these tools so that when they go out into other parts of their learning adventure, another class, after school, when they're studying on their own, they can use these because they've been incorporated them to actually be able to accelerate their understanding or improve their processing of new content. For example, Making Thinking Visible has thinking routines, but there's one routine that's called purposes, parts, and complexities. And I like to use it not because it's a strategy, but when I give it to students and I coach teachers to use it with students as a tool, now the student eventually internalizes it. So every new thing they look at, they can start to say, well, what's its purpose? Can I see the parts of it? What are the complexities between these parts? So that thinking and processing and looking at something actually is a learn how to learn process. So now their dendrites and brains actually grow new pathways so that every time they look at something new, they're going to be able to see its complexities in relationship to its parts. They're going to start to question, do I understand the purpose? And how do I figure that out? But do you see how that's self-perpetuating? You never lose that. Once you actually gain that ability to look at something through that lens, another I give students is the muddiest point, that your confusions are actually clues to your learning. So let's stick with that. So what's the muddiest point today? Where was I confused? Let me lean into that a little bit. How do we use errors as information? And that's part of having a feedback loop where students are actually being able to do their own gap analysis. So these are small things that when students are given those tools, but coached so they're not just one-off strategies, but literally empowering tools, now the student can never unsee the parts, purposes, and complexities.
It's almost like, in addition to helping students learn how to learn, we want them to learn how to love the struggle of learning.
That's right. Here's the thing about that. You cannot love the struggle until you feel you're progressing. So competence precedes confidence. And we know this because the brain has something called the progress principle, that we get a dopamine hit when we make progress. So say we need a 10, we need to get to 10, whatever the scale is, doing whatever. And we started at a 2. And after 3 weeks, we're at a 5. Now, we could be bummed, like, I'm at a 5, but it's like, if I look back, I actually see I started at a 2. Wow, if I keep going, I'm on the right path. When you see that you have made progress, your brain gives you a dopamine hit. It says, this has been hard, but keep going. So when we leverage that competence is and that dopamine hit generate that feeling we call confidence. And we have it kind of backwards. We're trying to get the kids confident and excited and curious when they are struggling destructively. So our coaching has to set the conditions that get students more of that positive. So if we know that there is some ground for them to make up coming out of the pandemic, we are going to have to leverage that intellectual curiosity. We're going to have to leverage the productive struggle and coach students how to do that. That shouldn't take us an academic year. The first 6 weeks, every teacher should be committed to helping students understand how to use errors as information. Here we've set up a feedback loop, and now I'm going to coach you through that. Hell, Serena Williams, the GOAT, needs a coach. Why? She doesn't have eyes in the back of her head. She wants to improve. Tiger Woods, at the height of his mastery of golf, had a coach. Why? It is about the process of improvement. And when we deny that to students, we are ensuring that we won't make progress on equity.
Well, some good examples of small, high leverage changes that school leaders, teachers, and students can be making. Zaretta, we are out of time for today's conversation, but thank you so much for joining us. If you're listening to this and wondering, what else did we talk about? Please head to pltogether.org for the rest of this conversation, as well as many others. Zaretta, it has been so great to talk with you, to learn from you. Thank you so much for being part of PL Together.
Well, thank you for letting me be a part of it.